Dear viewers, a warm welcome to today's session, Online Violence, the new frontline for journalists. My name is Pauline de Wilde, and I will guide you through the next hour of this session. And I will do that from the World Press Freedom Conference at the World Forum here in The Hague. And without further ado, I would like to immediately introduce to you Dr. Julie Posetti, who is the Global Director of Research of the International Center for Journalists and lead researcher of the UNESCO commissioned global study on online violence against women journalists. She is one of the leading academics in the field and will moderate a discussion with 3 speakers. She will also introduce a little bit later on today some of the preliminary results of a UNESCO ICFJ global study survey that ended last month, aimed at assessing the scope and impact of online violence against women journalists. Julie, are you there? Are you with us? Ik kan haar niet horen.
For allowing us to have this really important discussion. And hello to everybody who's participating around the world in this socially distanced but frankly critically important discussion on the online violence we're seeing against women journalists around the world. I just want to, before we start, give everybody a sense of the kind of experiences that women journalists around the world are living through on a daily basis, sometimes minute by minute, in very intimate and threatening ways. Let's have a look at this clip that demonstrates the toxic online environments that they operate in.
Someone sent me a message into my Facebook inbox and said, I don't know, the guy, he didn't have his real name. And he said in Serbian, I'm going to be killed with a sword.
Some people were telling what my phone number is. There was this man who was calling me and told me that I wasn't safe and I might get raped myself.
If you oppose something, if you're critical of something, and if you're a female journalist, then you become subject to hate speech.
Pero el añadido en nuestro caso es que tiene una connotación sexual, de ninguneo y de referencia a tu vida privada que no existe en el caso de los hombres.
Yo creo que cualquier ataque muy crudo a un periodista es evidente un intento por limitar su libertad de expresión y su manera de ejercer la profesión.
I had to question professional part of me, you know, is this what I want to do?
You have this urge to look behind when you walk on the street, you know, if somebody is following you or not.
It's a really dark place to be in, and if you're stuck in it for a really long time, I think it has severe repercussions on a person.
I cannot give up. I mean, I cannot surrender to those threats. So I'll keep doing what I'm doing, and here I am, standing tall and strong.
And that rather chilling clip showed scenes from the film A Dark Place, which was produced by the OSCE representative on media freedom. And you can watch that film during the conference in the cinema associated with the World Press Freedom Conference. So the main theme of today's discussion is this intersecting digital, psychological and physical safety threat that we're calling online violence. Journalists around the world, and they are disproportionately women journalists, are all too often confronted with this scourge of online violence that threatens to cause serious offline harm. It is not just an issue contained within the digital realm. But more than just damaging individual journalists, online violence also has a chilling effect on journalism more broadly and freedom of expression, along with the diversity in public debate. So female representation in and through the media is deeply affected here. It leads many women journalists to self-censor. It forces some of us offline for periods of time or even permanently. And it's actually led to women quitting their jobs and journalism altogether. It is an insidious problem and it really does need to be taken seriously. But it's also a problem exacerbated at the intersection of disinformation and hate speech, and we're certainly seeing our fair share of that in the year 2020. And research, including ours, suggests that the situation is deepening and worsening. So today we're launching the first 31 findings from a global survey of journalists around the world looking at this theme, and we'll dig into that a little later. It's a survey that was conducted by UNESCO and ICFJ, and what we wanted to do was to try and map the incidents and the impacts of online violence on women journalists in particular, with a specific emphasis at women in the global south who are far too often overlooked. So we'll come to that in a second, and we'll also hear from three prominent and celebrated international journalists who'll share their first-hand experience of this crisis. But first, I'm going to hand back to Pauline for some technical announcements.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. It's going to be an interesting discussion today. And we would like to hear from you. We would like to make this an interactive discussion. So please go ahead and submit your question. You can do that through the Q&A function. If you ask a question, please specify for which of the guest speakers it's addressed to, and also make it very concisely as possible. Your question will enrich this discussion, so please don't be shy and just ask anything that you want. That's what we're here for. So right away, over to you, Julie, and introduce the guest and lead the discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Pauline, and thanks to all of you who are participating. And I know in the audience will be many women who have experienced the kinds of threats and incidents that we're going to hear about today. So please do be in touch with us during this conversation. And we are honoured to be joined by three celebrated international investigative journalists and editors today. You'll learn more about them as we enter the conversation, so I won't spend too much time introducing them to you. But to say, Ferial Haffajee is one of South Africa's most prominent journalists. She's a celebrated editor. She's joining us today from South Africa. Carol Cadwallader, who is known around the world as an investigative reporter who has very bravely, in the face of unrelenting online attacks, continued to pursue the stories associated with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And the indomitable Rana Ayub, whose experiences of online violence were really so severe that it led a series of UN special rapporteurs to issue an alert to demand that she be protected. And Rana is joining us from India, Carol from the UK. So I've seen just the very tip of the iceberg of what it's like to be in the middle of one of the storms that all three of you have endured individually. And that's as a result of talking to you in online environments, and specifically about this issue of gendered online violence, and also specifically in the lead up to this event. When Carol and Rana in particular tweeted about this discussion today, their trolls came to join us instantaneously. And it was ugly, let me say, at the outset. And Rana, first I'm going to come to you because you've been brutally and prolifically attacked in orchestrated modes of attack as well, and specifically because of your investigative journalism and the kind of accountability reporting that you do in India. And you really sit at the intersection of risk, because not only are you a woman journalist who is determined to speak truth to power, but you're also a Muslim woman who is frequently targeted also for her religion and, based on some of the trolls' responses, the colour of your skin. So we really see a trilogy of attacks on you. But to help us understand both the scale and the intensity of what you have experienced, can you just give us some insights into, say, the history and the evolution of this online onslaught that you've experienced?
Well, Julie, I think these online attacks against me have been happening for more than 13, 14 years, through all platforms. But it has taken a momentous toll for the last 6 years, when I published my book, which is an undercover operation on Narendra Modi, who is Indian Prime Minister, who's a conservative of the Conservative Party, the BJP. Like you rightly pointed out, Julie, the attack is not just because I'm a journalist, an investigative journalist, but also somebody who's a Muslim who, in the current scheme of things in India, should be seen as a second-class citizen. So how dare she speak, and how dare a woman speak? So every time I put a story on social media, a tweet, like sometimes I've experimented doing this. I've just put a full stop, and there are like 1,000 replies calling me jihadi Jane, asking to rape me, killing me, giving me death threats. So and this is like an everyday affair for me. This is not something that has recently happened, or even if I post something like I'm going to do relief work or I'm with my nephew, this kind of happens. And the reason why it's happening is because those in the government who cannot target journalists with facts use this to discredit them, to intimidate them into silence. And that's what's happened. When I went undercover to expose Narendra Modi, and I came out and I started tweeting about it, it started with rape threats, death threats. I was doxxed. Um, uh, a pornographic video was morphed on my photograph, and sorry, my photograph was morphed on a porn video, and that video was spread all over the country. In a country of 1.2 billion people, that video was in every phone, every WhatsApp, Twitter, on my Instagram. Then I was doxxed. My telephone number, my address put on social media. I got burnt copies of my book at home. And every message that came to me on WhatsApp, they were asking me for my rates. How much do I charge? Screenshots of that porn video were shared across my Facebook. Leaders of the ruling party actually shared this video on their page, so much so that I remember when one of India's leading news channel did a show on me. They got somebody from the ruling government to respond to it, and he said, well, if you go out in the rains, you expect to get wet. So you feel helpless at times. And like you pointed out, Julie, when the UN intervened, when the United Nations Special Rapporteurs, for the first time in individual case in India, when 6 UN rapporteurs spoke to the Indian government to protect my safety, the Indian government said that I'm trying to malign their reputation on an international platform. Some of the most well-meaning people said that, you are getting upset about something which is only online. And my only response to them is, my colleague Gauri Lankesh, who was murdered in 2017 right outside her house. She was murdered in broad daylight, and she was murdered within a week of her publishing my book in a regional language. A day before she was shot dead, she called me to say, don't take these online attacks personally. These are nincompoops. And I saw that online immediately became offline in her case. So this, when I have gone to police stations, to cops, to file complaints against the pornographic video, the rape and death, they all tell me the same thing. Oh, it's online. They do not realize that there's a very thin line between online and offline. Journalists have been the enemy of the state for quite some time. But now with social media and the way leaders of the government are amplifying that hate, it is becoming a lot more difficult. It is becoming overwhelming and exhausting, Julie.
Indeed, indeed. And it's also relevant at this stage to point out that in our survey, we found that 20% of the women who responded said that they had experienced almost what you're describing, offline attacks and abuse that they believed was seeded online. So there is now, thankfully, evidence, to actually start to support this correlation between online attacks and offline attacks. And that is where the risk is most extreme, of course, which is not to diminish the psychological injury associated with prolific and prolonged online harassment, which is also something that's been underestimated, I think. But you mentioned there, Rana, that you seem to know that some of your attackers, some of the perpetrators, were associated with government. Is that the case? What have you been able to establish in terms of perhaps your investigative work, in terms of identifying and understanding who's behind these networks? And also, I'm interested to know on what platform you felt that you were most vulnerable.
Yeah, so basically the WhatsApp video, the porn video on which my image was morphed, came to me via a person in the government who also happens to be my source. So he called me up in the morning. He said, I'm sending you something. Please please do not let it get to you. I watched that video and I couldn't watch it beyond 5 seconds. And I said, where did you find this? He said it was in the group of a WhatsApp group of BJP leaders, the ruling party members. Not just that, they also shared in. I mean, one of India's leaders from the ruling party, Yogi Adityanath, his fan page had my video, my porn video, with fake images saying that I hate India, I hate Indians, that I support Islamic fascism and Islamic radicalization. All of this was fake. But by the time you kind of, there are fact checking websites in India. By the time they kind of dispel all of that, and by the time they clarify that this is a morphed video, this is fake news, that image goes viral across the country. Twitter, of course, I mean, for me, both Twitter and Facebook have been platforms that, they actually overwhelm you, because I think these people are just, they just brazened it out, because, the fact that they give me a rape thread, they put my picture online with blood spots on it, and Twitter does not believe that it is enough to suspend that account. So I think between Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram, where we are there because we are independent journalists, and we also because we need to amplify our work. But the cost that we are paying to amplify our work on social media um, is not something any journalist should really face. And the most problematic part is that these social media platforms, whether it is Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, they have not even acknowledged that this is a problem. Each time I report a tweet that is hateful, that gives a death threat to me, I get the same response, uniform response on Twitter, that this does not violate our privacy policy, or whatever that means. So clearly, there is no solution as such in mind. It's like, because they don't recognize there is a problem. They will act on the problem when they recognize the problem. They don't even concede that this is a problem.
Sure. I'll leave it there, Rana, for now, and we'll get into those issues around the sources and the impacts of online violence in your case more specifically later. But Carol, I'd like to move to you now. Your investigative work in the UK on Brexit and Cambridge Analytica, highlights some of the threats that women journalists are facing, particularly when reporting on issues that might be considered incendiary or associated with populist politics. And you've been exposed to some pretty rancid attacks online, which probably could be called digital gaslighting, to put it mildly. Can you please just provide us some of the context for the attacks that you've experienced, and perhaps give us an indication of when you saw the trolls starting to pile on and what your initial reaction was?
Thanks so much, Julie. And I just want to say it's so nice being here. I think there is a lot to be said for sort of solidarity, and also I think this international solidarity, because I think it can feel really specific to your particular situation or the particular politics or whatever. And I think finding these common links across these international platforms is a sort of really important step forward. And I have to say, I'm just horrified listening to Rana. And, I feel very lucky and fortunate in that I haven't experienced anything to the degree that she has. I mean, I think the thing of the porn film is just so horrific. And Rana, I'm so sorry for what you've been through. But
Thank you.
I suppose at the same time, I would say is that I think the issue perhaps I face is that it's not considered an issue at all. That there is a lesser version of this in being perpetrated in Britain and the United States and other countries. And I think the thing I find most difficult about it is that the misogyny, the kind of daily misogynistic abuse that I get simply through looking at Twitter, essentially, is not recognised as abuse. And that's, I think, the thing that has sort of come to trouble me most profoundly, is that this sort of gross sexism that I get from, particularly from being a middle-aged woman, that's particularly offensive to many of my critics. It's just not recognised as a category of abuse in a way which I do think in Britain if it was racism or anti-Semitism, it wouldn't be tolerated to the degree that it is, in that it's just simply misogyny, if you see what I mean.
Simply
So, Julie,
misogyny,
sorry, I'm
indeed.
doing a really poor job of answering your question about how it began, but I think it's been this thing of boiling the frog. I think because I sort of started out, you know, I started when I really hated Twitter. I wanted no part of social media. I really stood against it. I joined it very, very late, and I only started using Twitter when I started doing this story, when I started investigating Cambridge Analytica. And at that time, I just had, I think, a few hundred followers. And so for me, it's been this sort of snowballing effect. Is I got more followers, and then as my work started to have an impact, it started to attract more criticism and more trolls. And I think I've sort of lost sight really of it in many respects, because now it is so much part of my daily experience. Only when it becomes, I go through there's sort of extreme cycles I go through where it is this incredible pile on. And for me, it's not just, for me, it's a sort of network, in that it's not just online trolls. It's very much seeded by a sort of online, by a sort of right-wing news network, essentially. It's and Russian propaganda outlets, for example. So something so there's some ridiculous article about me on some right-wing blog in Britain, and that spawns these other articles by Russia Today and by Sputnik. And then from there also they come into the sort of more respectable end of the, supposedly more respectable end of the UK press. And that's the thing, that's what sort of sets it off, if you see what I mean. So it's not just that these are sort of nameless trolls online. It is also this sort of coordinated disinformation network that that I sort of see operating in, as one larger network, I suppose. And that it is, I think as Rana says, is that it's just overwhelming. It's sort of, it bothers me, I guess, in ways which I think the thing about it, somebody said, is that even if you choose to ignore it, that takes a lot of, essentially a lot of thought, of time, of brain power. So every time it's like thinking about how I deal with this. Do I ignore it? Do I make fun of it? Do I report it? Every sort of decision tree just takes a lot of time and energy in which you're having to think about this stuff. And I think that's the thing that I find most exhausting. I generally do figure out a way of dealing with it and addressing it and sort of rising above it. But it does take me time, and it does sort of wear me down a little bit more each time that it happens.
And you've just highlighted some of the key findings from this new research we're publishing today. One of the findings is that in 41% of cases reported by the women journalists we surveyed, 41% of them said that they'd been attacked in the context of coordinated disinformation campaigns. Your response also about this sense of fatigue and exhaustion, and just the time sap, which distracts you from, your accountability journalism, and the ways in which, populist politics drive this. You've illustrated all of that. And I think the other point to underline, which we'll come back to, is that your reporting is also about, or certainly in the Cambridge Analytica context, it's also about big tech, powerful companies, and you're trying to hold them to account through what you call the real Facebook oversight board. So let's come back to that. I just want to move now, though, to Ferial. And Ferial, in the dying years of the Zuma presidency in South Africa, you were viciously and prolifically targeted for your critical commentary and reporting. And I think you were one of the first South African women journalists to speak out about this. But as the years drew on, you wrote really poignantly and revealingly about the way that cumulative pile-on had really left you with less confidence and a desire to withdraw. So I'd like you, first of all, just to take us through, what it was like for such a renowned and fierce editor as yourself to suddenly feel this sense of chilling as a result of online violence.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you for an empowering piece of research. I really, really learned from reading it, and it's an honor to be with Rana and Carol this morning. So I'll go back a little bit. I mean, I'm a passionate South African journalist because I was a reporter under apartheid. I witnessed the freedom years and all its hope, and then I have witnessed also the 10 years of the kleptocracy of our former president, Jacob Zuma. And I was very much part of uncovering that, of writing about it. It's a system that we call state capture. And I'm quite a serious-minded and sometimes quite a shy person. So to wake up after doing one of those stories and find myself on Twitter, which until then was a platform I'd quite enjoyed, and to see myself, my face put on a picture of a cow and of a dog and of being in a chorus line and of being either on the knee of or in the bed of a very famous billionaire who was in the line of attack of this trolling army as well, was extremely shocking because I didn't understand doxing, I didn't understand trolling armies. It just seemed to come from the blue. Anyway, from what we know now is that it was the work of a very famous and now defunct, thank God, a PR company called Bell Pottinger. But what it did teach me is that these are organized trolling armies, very often by public relations companies. And since then, I mean, it's gone on and on and on. And yes, I did write about its very chilling impact on you, because your phone is it's an appendage. It's part of your body now. And so those attacks, they're personal. They're right into you. And I wrote because I was surprised by my own response, by how it was shaming me, how I felt I needed to explain those images to my family who don't really know the world of social media or doxing or deepfakes. And I said I was going to withdraw. But I suppose writing that essay has been, Julie, very empowering for me, because you find solidarity, and I also found strength. And I think I defanged the trolls by writing about it. But then, since then, I have a very different social media persona now. But I also take comfort in solidarity networks like this one. But what it has made me an activist for is for greater accountability from the platforms. Because as Rana has said, I mean, just last 2 weeks ago, I again reported somebody for saying, you really have to die now. It's because death threats are quite regular. I sent it to Twitter. 2 weeks on, I've not heard a thing. And that's fairly standard practice. Or you'll get a tweet back saying it conforms with our standards. So what kinds of standards are those? And sometimes I feel sitting in the deep south, for me on the southern tip of Africa, is really Twitter couldn't give a damn. Is that you're reporting in probably to an outsourced reporting factory where people don't understand the issues, and they're sending you these very rote responses. So I've been really inspired by the work of Shoshana Bobov, who has told us that we have every right to expect a greater accountability from the platforms. And so now I very much consider myself an activist for building that kind of accountability, because the way the platforms treat us when we are users, when we are part of their success, is absolutely pathetic. And in my country, you really can't think that the police or the criminal justice system is going to be able to help you, because often our police officers don't even have mobile phones or data, so they cannot do that kind of sophisticated digital forensic work. So yes, my position has changed since feeling shamed, etc., but it has made me, I guess, realize that this is an essential frontier to protect media freedom, and specifically to protect it for women, for whom it has been a decades-long struggle to enable us to report politics and investigations and to claim our spaces in newsrooms where often we've been consigned, as you know very well, to other beats. So I'm not going to be pushed away. It's taken too many people's work to get us to do the work that we want to do. Huh?
So this is time for the collaborative fight back. I think that's one of the themes coming through here. And that fight back is not just about solidarity between women and those who defend women journalists around the world, but also in holding the platforms to account, of course, and not just the state actors that are often associated with these online attacks, or the misogynistic mobs. So as you've heard from Rana in India, from Ferial in South Africa, and Carol in the UK, three very different contexts, but very similar experiences, at least if you compare some of the triggers and factors. So women reporting at the intersection of disinformation, populist politics, and coming from contexts where there are intersectional risks as well. So I think now, Pauline, let's take a closer look at this survey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julie. In order to gain a better understanding of this issue, and in particular to see what the impact is on female journalists around the world, UNESCO and ICFJ recently conducted a survey which was completed by more than 900 people in 5 different languages from 125 countries. So, Julie, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the survey, the intention behind it, and some preliminary results.
Sure. And as I said, we have actually just published today, and I'll share the link shortly on Twitter, a report which presents, in fact, 31 findings from this study and makes some preliminary recommendations. And it very much fills in the picture that's just been painted so vividly there by Rana and Ferial and Carol. So we produced this survey as a way of trying to get a sense at the global, macro level, what the situation is in 2020 for women journalists around the world. And we deliberately attempted to make this work as genuinely reflective of diverse international geographic, cultural, linguistic experiences, because as I think Ferial just pointed out so effectively, many women operating in many parts of the world, particularly in non-Anglo and non-Western environments, find it extremely difficult to follow the protocols that have been suggested. Not that they can't do it, but they are not getting the kinds of support and response, and certainly not the kinds of effective responses that we need to see if this issue is to be tackled appropriately. And that's not just a question of the platforms, it's a question of policy, of law reform, and also based on our survey, news organisations still have a long way to go in order to provide the sort of support and the recognition of this crisis that's needed. So the first step was to try and map the incidence and the impacts of online violence around the world. And if we can go now to some of these slides, I'll talk you through some of the findings. So as you can see there, 73% of women who we asked if they'd experienced online violence in the course of their work, which is an important thing to note. These are women saying that while doing their jobs in the context of social media and online environments, 73% of them said that they had in fact been targeted with online violence. And that is a trend that if you look at historical surveys, you can't directly compare our survey necessarily with historical surveys, but we can deduce, a significant increase over time in the problem, certainly in terms of its depth and its severity, and just the broad sweep of women who are being affected by this. And we can go to the next slide. So this is another really important finding coming from this research, and it's especially important in environments where women journalists find themselves at greater physical risk, where there are higher rates of the murder of journalists, and particularly murder with impunity. So 20% of the women who we asked about their experiences of offline violence, whether in fact they had any indication that this had been in fact seeded online, 20% said yes, they had experienced offline attacks and abuse, which they believed were connected to online attacks against them. And when we look more closely at the data and some of the descriptions that the women offered us, they made this conclusion. They drew this conclusion partly on the basis of hearing particular phrases that they recognised from mantras on the internet that were being targeted. They were being targeted with, for example, and lots of other evidence to boot. So let's move to the next slide. And the other important thing to do is, of course, to take stock of the different types and kinds of threats that women journalists are experiencing online. And we heard already from our speakers that this can include a range of digital threats. It can include hateful and abusive language, private messages that are unwanted and often harassing, threats of physical violence, including death threats, threats of sexual violence, and also the sorts of digital threats. We've mentioned doxing, we've mentioned, which of course involves the publication online of women's personal details that increases the physical risk that they face, things like their address, their phone numbers, and so on. And 18% said they'd been subjected to surveillance. So on top of that, the doxing and the spoofing, which is where your account is taken over or otherwise misappropriated to misrepresent you. So those are some of the threats, and I think we have one more, or perhaps two more slides we can give some feedback on. So the top perpetrators of online violence against women journalists. So while the first group is unsurprising, over half said that unknown or anonymous sources were the ones that they identified as the main attackers. Disturbingly, sources and contacts and colleagues, as well as staff from rival media organisations, were prevalent as well. But I just want you to focus for a second on government officials, politicians, and political party officials or workers. So you're seeing there evidence of the ways in which political actors are operating at the intersection of disinformation and misogynistic attacks on women journalists to try to silence them, sometimes very effectively. But this is a really disturbing aspect of our findings. Okay, so that's what we've found so far, and you can read more about that in the report that is online, hopefully now. People should be sharing that. So as you saw, 73% of the women we surveyed said they'd been targets, 20% said they'd experienced offline attacks connected to online. Carol, that figure of 73% might not surprise you, but it's still pretty shocking. I'm just wondering, from your point of view, what it signals about what's required in response to this problem.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for doing this work and this research. And it was really funny. When I was in the middle of one massive pile-on last week, part of your research was published, and I was like, aha, see, there's actual research being done in this now. Please take it seriously. And that was actually really helpful to me, because it is not taken seriously. It's been absolutely normalized. And I think one of the things which sitting here has made me think about is actually the obligation of, particularly of those of us in the West, to not stand for this, because you can see how it extends out. So it's normalized it's normalized in, as you sort of say, in countries where it's easier for us to get a response from these platforms, and yet we don't get a response. But the extension of that means that it's normalized in countries where, like Rana and Ferial are, and where the ramifications are so much more extreme. So it's really reminded me actually of this necessity that this is, it's of why we do have to, it's incumbent upon us to make a noise about this, and not because of our own experience of it, but really for the experience, I think, of, as I say, and our colleagues in countries where it has so much more extreme repercussions. But Julie, there's so much in there, I thought, and the thing I think which is really key, which you pull out there, which is that I think in some respects we think of this as hate speech, but as you say, it's also disinformation, and I think it's really invisible to the naked eye, the ways in which this is organised or coordinated, and it is, specifically targeted to discredit individual journalists, to discredit their work. And I really don't think that's recognised. I don't think it's recognised by news organisations. I don't think this thing of, as you sort of said, that actually if your subject that you are reporting on is disinformation, if it is populist politics, then you are going to turn into a target of disinformation and populist politics. And I think, as I say, I really feel that there's much more that news organisations, I think, are incredibly naive still about this landscape. That this is part of the threat landscape against journalists now, and essentially it says that you are operating in a hostile environment. And one of the things I feel is that sort of younger journalists, I really feel for younger female journalists coming into this space, because why, I can just see it putting off people. It's meant to put off people. It's, it is literally meant to try and silence us. And that's why I think I loved Ferial's reaction to say, actually, she's, gone on a real journey in feeling shamed by it. I thought that was very powerful, and now really feel so activated of why we have to sort of stand up and respond to this.
Indeed. And Ferial, I'll come to you now. As Carol just pointed out, their news organisations, and this is borne out in our research, are still apparently not taking this as seriously as they should be. The most common response of the 25% of women who said that they had reported online violence incidents to their employer, the most common response they said they got was no response. They were also told things like, you need to grow a thicker skin. And in disturbing finding, 2% of them, although it's not a huge number, but 2% of them said that they were asked what they did to actually trigger the attacks, which is so reminiscent of the kinds of struggles that women have had with regards to sexual assault, for example, in the physical world. So you have been a long-time editor, Ferial. What does that problem about news organisations' response to this tell you about what needs to be done?
A tough one. I must say, when I read your the findings as well as the recommendations yesterday, I kept going, yes, that's what we need to do. So I think it's a new field, and I was editing in one newsroom, and now I'm a journalist in another, and I think that owners and editors, they simply don't know what to do, and so they I think unconsciously and certainly often without bad faith adopt that, like you say, the victim blaming mode, and as you say, it's mute, block, get off the platform. So that does become a way of victim blaming, or what did you do, or we told you to not be on Twitter so much. And for me, that's not really the answer. But I see, and it's interesting to see that it's a problem across newsrooms, is that we simply haven't grappled enough with how do you support journalists who face this? And as Carol said, it's really, really worrying that young people, young women are facing this a lot, from the research shows us, and it could be a push factor out of an industry or a craft that's already in serious trouble because of COVID-19. It could push people into PR in even greater numbers. And where I think I disagree with you, and maybe it's because of where I am, is I do think the greatest responsibility does lie with the platforms, because they are transnational and they're global and they're enormously powerful. And I'm not even sure what nation states like mine could do. You can pass policies and maybe do research, but for me, this is a global issue that needs to be taken up with the companies. And I have to say, I have noticed that, thank God for the pressure that people like you have put on them. My life on Twitter is much better because they've allowed that new functionality where you can determine who can reply to you. And that's cleaned up the platform in my own experience, and I'd love to hear what the other colleagues. And that has only happened because pressure pushed them to make changes. So I really do believe in advocacy, campaigning, and global solidarity as key methods. So
important. And we're going to go to some questions next. But before we do, some questions from the audience. Rana, if I can just briefly come back to you. One point that we haven't mentioned yet, and this affects Carol as well, is that very many of the women who are being targeted are freelance journalists. You're a freelance journalist yourself. So, this solidarity becomes even more important. But you are operating in an environment that really probably does pose the greatest risk in terms of, the threat of physical repercussions. Can you just tell us briefly what you would like to see done at the level of, say, the platforms, for example, in responding to this problem?
Well, Julie, I think first things first, you should send these findings to all these governments and news media organizations which still do not consider this a problem. And it is difficult to be an independent journalist, but I'm just wondering, yes, we do not, nobody has got our back, but even those journalists who are employed by their organizations, the moment they complain, they are being told to share less controversial views on Twitter and don't become too political, don't indulge in activism, don't put your pictures on social media. That's the only response you get from these news organizations. I know of a bright young journalist in New Delhi who published a report on anti-Muslim carnage in India, and she was hounded by on social media. She was abused. She was given threats. There were people in the locality who came and questioned their family. Her organization asked her to lie low. So the onus of of being safe in this environment is on us, the ones who suffer. And for the longest time, Julie, I used to feel humiliated. For instance, when every time I would see a man saying, "Hey, let me fuck you," all sorts of things, and let me sexual positions, I would feel humiliated myself, and I would I'd be like, let me not go on social media for some time. And that's what they do. They silence, because you are so exhausted dealing with Twitter and Facebook. I mean, Ferial made an important point about Twitter. Twitter, advancing the security by. I mean, the UK, there's a setting on which only those you follow can reply to you. But that also, in a way, censors a larger free voice. Why should everybody? You want to hear everybody's voice. Why should only your friends or those who follow you give advice to you? That feedback when you write a story, when you tweet, should come from everybody. Why is it that we have to kind of go to a setting that says only those who I follow will respond? That's not fair. We need an atmosphere which is fair and which allows us to do our journalism and speak our mind without being intimidated or shamed into this. This is why they do. I mean, when they do a porn video with somebody's image morphed in it, especially a woman, it's not just misogyny. You are trying to shame that person into silence, and that's exactly what happened to me when it happened. I wanted to quit social media. I wanted to quit journalism. That's what they want to do. I mean, something like this does not happen to a man. It only happens to women, because I can talk about myself. India is a patriarchal country where there's so much virtue placed on a woman's character. If I had been a part of any other household, my parents would have said, hey, why don't you quit your profession? There's no solution anywhere. And I am still talking as a journalist with a public voice who has international recognition. I feel sorry for women journalists in rural areas in India who are sticking their neck out to report the stories. And when they see this kind of threat, their immediate reaction from their family is to quit the profession. So we are still the privileged ones here who have access, yeah.
Yeah, indeed, and I mean you've highlighted there some of the most striking findings about this sense of chilling of reporting, but also this sense that women feel a need to make themselves invisible in women journalists in an effort to protect themselves, and that the onus is so frequently on women. So really important points to highlight. And Pauline, now let's go to some of the questions from those of you who've been listening to this meaningful and sometimes moving conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I'm fascinated by all the things that you're telling me as somebody who's just using and listening to the work of journalists. To Carol, we cannot sue platforms for what users post on them, but what about their algorithm that amplifies hate speech and death threats based on the number of likes and interactions a post gets? What can we do about that?
Well, I think it's, as Ferial said, is that essentially the answers are at the level of the platforms, and so I think that we have to call out the platforms. We have to demand accountability. As she says, is that I think just yesterday, I sit there, I report, I block, I report. And I can't think of, hardly ever have I reported a tweet, an abuser, and they've said, thank you for we found, that this was in breach of our guidelines. Every time it comes back and sort of says, we can't see the problem there. And as Ferial says, these are poor underpaid workers in some crappy shed in the Philippines somewhere doing the dirty work of the platforms. Or it's an AI. That's the other thing, is that they're training AI to sort of distinguish what is abuse and what is not. And we know that the sort of biases of those are ingrained. And so they maybe cannot see that the threats against women, and particularly women of colour, are sorry, just sorry, I slightly lost my thread there. But there is sort of inherent problems there, and that is where I think we have to take the fight. That is the only place really where we can get active change. But yet, at the moment, it isn't being recognised, and that's where as I sort of say, I think this is where, like Julie, this kind of research, having academics sort of looking at this in detail and explaining it, is a sort of is a step forward, and hopefully that this might be a first sort of stepping stone to bringing some sort of accountability.
Yeah, and if we this is a discussion of a lot among women journalists, and we are looking for where can we put some responsibility, of course. And Ferial, what's the responsibility of male journalists, editor, media managers?
I would like to think that it's too okay. I'll give you a South African example. So we have a very strong body of editors and senior journalists, and they have taken up this issue because they see us as a community of one, and there's a great unity in that. So when you feel like there's solidarity from all your colleagues, including the male leaders, that's really, really important. And I have to say, because our constitution is so big on non-sexism here, you haven't seen that immediate response of like some of my colleagues have spoken about, where male owners or male editors would come up with intrinsically sexist attitudes and responses to the women journalists. So a slightly different story here, where I have felt a great, and all of us who have experienced this have felt great unity across women and men colleagues.
Thank you. And of course, there are more questions because it's such an important topic. But we don't want to end the session on an action-oriented. We do want to end the section on an action-oriented note. So, Julie, do you think that enough is being done to combat online harassment against women journalists?
No, absolutely not. I think as this research confirms, the crisis is deepening. Despite our intention to try and surface more effective measures to respond to the crisis, what we're learning so far is that the gains we thought we may have made have in fact not been significant enough. I mean, we certainly are seeing some fantastic collaborations between civil society and researchers and journalists, and that's great. But there is so much work to be done, and one of the biggest challenges really is the structural failures within the new information ecosystem that we all operate within. And it's not an option for women to be invisible. It's not an option for women to abandon digital technology, social platforms when it comes to actually doing their jobs in journalism anymore. So it's critical now for intergovernmental organisations, for big tech, for news industry, and also for researchers to collaborate to find the solutions. And in the spirit of trying to find some kind of way of looking forward, a more kind of action-oriented way, Ferial, if you could single out just one measure, just one thing that could perhaps more effectively address the experiences of women journalists around the world online, what would it be?
So, Julie, I guess I'm inspired by the project of where the colleagues of slain journalists continue their work. So it's to use our craft to deal with this issue. And for me, it would be to have more algorithm correspondents around the world who are able to investigate and also investigate the reporting systems of platform companies in order to come up with better positions and advocacy positions to further those changes and to ensure that they are made. Because at the moment, I think we don't know how things work. And what this might give us is greater knowledge, in the same way that your research arms us with knowledge to do the campaigns and the advocacy work that is so sorely needed right now.
Thanks, Ferial. And if I can come to you next, Rana, I know this is a big question. There is no one single solution, but I suppose the question is really, what is the greatest need and what could the most urgent response look like from where you're sitting?
The greatest need is for bodies of various bodies of editors, like the Editors Guild in India or various other guilds, to first accept that this is a problem that has plagued our profession. When in my case, when I filed a complaint with the Editors Guild of India, there was no reaction, absolutely no reaction, because they didn't even consider it a problem. They say, you know what, let it be. I mean, there are bigger issues that need to be dealt with. And I totally agree with Feria that we need to, we are still not being able to explore what could be done to make sure that it becomes a safer platform. There certainly needs to be an advocacy group that grills Twitter, Facebook, and all these social media platforms, because it is becoming unbreathable. And for independent journalists, social media is an extremely important platform. So we cannot quit this. Asking us to become invisible, asking us to quit is not the solution. So I think there has to be a body that holds Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to account in the way it should be. But I don't know if that will happen, because very recently, one of the key people in Twitter India was seen posting an Islamophobic comment in India, and of course, it took about 8 months for Facebook to fire her. So I don't think they want to concede there's a problem. And the first thing that they should begin with is to acknowledge that yes, there is a problem and it is impacting a lot of lives.
Thanks, Rana. And Carol, the final word to you, in fact, as somebody who is taking a role to try and hold the platforms accountable, and as somebody who I think has also pursued legal action. We haven't had time to think about the legal and judicial response here, but what would you say is most critically needed, and what can be done?
I actually think that doing things like this event, and I think talking about our experiences is and about how it affects us, I think that is a really important first step. And because I think, as Rana has said, is that news organisations are oblivious or in denial, or as Ferial says, they don't know what to do about it. But the thing is that we need leadership from them. If we had leadership from news organisations, they would be listened to far more by the platforms, I think. And so I think that's where my focus at the moment is, that one thing which is within our power, these are our colleagues, these are our bosses, these are the people that we work for. And I do think that we have to take this message to them and ask them to step up and join us in this fight, because we can't do it alone. I mean, the whole impetus of this abuse is to make us feel alone, and it's to make us feel isolated, it's to make us feel ashamed, it's to make us appear controversial to our colleagues and to our editors. And that is something which, it affects us professionally, it affects us personally. And I think this shared experience, solidarity and leadership against the platforms is the sort of where we can focus our energies and where I think we could have impact.
Thanks very much. And we have to wind up here. Our time is out. But thank you for being so candid and so engaged with one another, as well as with this research. I think you've underlined the points really effectively, all of you. And, as our colleague and friend Maria Ressa would say, who has also deployed investigative journalism as a way of combating this crisis, we have to hold the line together. We have to refuse to be silenced. But at the same time, I would argue we need to respect and support the women who have felt sidelined and silenced as a result of this. This study has been published today, the first of a series of reports that UNESCO and ICFJ will publish. It's available now. I've tweeted it, and colleagues from UNESCO have put it on the platform for this conference. So in the library attached to this session, you'll find it. Thanks very much for joining us. And those of you in the audience whose questions we couldn't get to, I'm sorry. I thought it was very important to let our colleagues speak, but please contact us online in a supportive and encouraging way. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Carol, Rana, and Veriel. Thank you for being so open and vulnerable. And I really liked it what you said in the beginning, Carol, that international solidarity, is that what you felt, right, already in this event, but also with research. And I really hope that we get more recognition and we get the right support so that you can keep doing the beautiful and so important job that you're doing. So thank you very much. And Julie, thank you for being with us and being such a great host. Really, really thank you, and for putting so much work in the research. And for now, just let's keep up the positive vibes. And for you, participants, thank you for listening to us. And I hope you really be motivated to take the next step on this very important issue. Have a great day.